Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Laser Radio. My name is Brad Sohner. Today we're continuing with the Legends of American Cycling series, talking to George Mount. George was a member of the 1976 Olympic team. He went on to win the 1978 Red Zinger before being caught up in the 1980 Olympic boycott, where he was really one of the favorites to win the gold medal. We talk about that, his decision to go live and train in Europe, the advice that Eddie Merckx gave him, and the possibility of some sabotage in the professional peloton. All that and more on the episode today, brought to you by the new Laser Bullet helmet, the perfect combination of aerodynamics and ventilation. The Bullet is designed with a narrow front profile and smooth top section with minimal venting for maximum aerodynamic benefit. The air slide system allows for ventilation on demand with a quick and easy adjustment of the front vent cap, compatible with both the Laser LifeBeam integrated heart rate monitor system and the Laser inclination sensor position monitor. The Bullet is available in both standard and MIPS versions. In stock and available now, visit your local Laser dealer for more information on the Laser Bullet. George, first off, thanks for joining us. I know you've had kind of a chaotic last few weeks wrapping up a move in your world. Where did you come from and where did you move to?
Well, I've been in the San Francisco Bay Area for most of my life and working in Silicon Valley in tech for the last 30 plus years. So I lost my job a while back. Nobody wanted to hire me, and I was kind of contemplating getting out of there anyway. So we had decided to move to Grants Pass, Oregon, which is just across the border from California. So still similar weather to California, but it's a little more in the woods, to put it mildly. Got 5 acres of land and a bunch of trees and a big shop and I'm 10 miles outside of town. And I can go out my back door and hike down to the Rogue River and fish for 20-pound steelhead.
Sounds pretty perfect to me.
Yeah, and they got lots of gravel roads around here, BLM land, Forest Service, tons of it around here. So I fully intend to spend a lot of time this summer exploring those roads on my bicycle.
Yeah, plenty of good riding, that's for sure. I want to talk more about the Bay Area, because that was sort of your, obviously you grew up there, but that was the catalyst of your racing career. You had a really interesting kind of start to your bike racing career. Tell me the story about the draft, how you moved out of your house, and how you came to know bike racing.
Yeah, the draft. Well, I grew up in the 70s, that age, and I graduated high school in 73. So I lived in a fairly turbulent time, fairly close to Berkeley and places like that. So needless to say, my political leanings didn't match with my father's. And when I graduated from high school, I was 17, and the draft had just concluded with just a year or so less. And but there was still registration and all that, and the war was still going on. And I had friends who had, gone and come back from Vietnam, and they're pretty miserable about it. And I had quite a few who had gone to Vietnam and didn't return, either physically or mentally. And I was not going to go and get drafted for that. And so I didn't register for the draft and all that, figuring that would give me a little bit more time to get out of the country if I had to. And my father was not in agreement with that. And so he basically threw me out of the house. So I left home when I was about 17 and found a place to crash in Berkeley with me and my bicycle. I had just started racing bikes shortly before that. Then that was that. And I decided that in life you have 3 things that you want to do, and typically 2 that you have the time or the necessity to do. And the first one is you got to work, unless you're independently wealthy. And the second thing, you have to pick between 2 things you want to do. And I had a choice of going to university or going to race bicycles, and I figured I can always go to college, but I felt like I had an opportunity to live an interesting life and do some things on a bicycle. So I decided that I would put off college, which I still kind of working on, and race bikes and try to make a living at it. And everywhere I went and everywhere I turned, from my father to everybody who worked in a bike shop to everybody who was a bike racer, did absolutely everything they could to discourage me, told me all kinds of fantastic tales about how horrible bike racing was, how Americans could never race bikes in Europe, how I mean, just the stories on and on and on, which being 17 years old just made me want to do it more. And that's sort of how I, as they say in the horse business, how the horse set the bit in his teeth.
Yeah. You were working at a bike shop pretty much from the start, and this is kind of how you connected with Peter Rich, who is, it sounds like, a big part of your story. Tell me more about Peter early on.
Sure. Well, Peter is, he put on the first tour of California in 1971, 7 days long, had teams from Germany and Mexico and places. Incredible thing. Nobody'd ever seen anything like it in the country. And, it wasn't repeated until the Red Zinger came along, essentially. Well, there was the Tour of the Sierra that Larry Gluckfeld had put on. It was a little bit shorter in 74, I think it was. Peter was one of the guys who had been to Europe in the 60s. There were a lot of racers, Bob Tetzloff, Peter, a bunch of guys who went to Europe and tried they tried to make it a little bit in Europe. And so he had some experience, and he was the only guy that I ran into who had actually, been on a bicycle and raced in races in Europe and stuff like that, and had some idea, albeit at a much lower level than the professional level, but he'd been over there. And so he apparently saw some talent in me. I won a couple of races, hard races, and offered me a job at the shop and let me live upstairs with we had a toaster oven and a hot plate and a shower. And a couple other guys later moved in also. We had a little group, and he was in the process of reanimating a club that he wanted to sponsor for his Velosport Bike Club. So this was to be sort of the centerpiece of his shop. He had this club a while, and it was sort of disappeared, and he decided he wanted to make a European style bike race team. So like I said, I was sort of a centerpiece of that, and he got this club going again. It was the first club that had a van painted the color of the bikes. Everybody had their bikes painted. Everybody had the same jerseys. Everybody had warm-ups, and it was all that Molteni orange, or a brighter orange, that sort of Merckx bike orange, which was very loud. And Peter understood team tactics and racing and all that kind of stuff, much more so than I think anybody else on the West Coast. And in putting the team together, he spent a lot of time with the riders, and made us do crazy, insane rides, a lot of fixed gear, a lot of track, riding, our track bikes and our road bikes through the parks on single tracks, just for bike skills, things like that. And, built up a pretty darn good team, and took us on the road a bit. And so that was, Kismet, that was one of the lucky things that happened to me. And I was having Peter sort of take me under his wings and teach me what he knew, and then allow me to go beyond that.
Yeah, and it happened from a young age. I mean, you're talking about basically starting when you're 17. How soon after that did you realize that you had the potential? I mean, you had the natural talent and a real chance to go to Europe.
Well, at that age, you already know everything, right? So I already knew I had the talent. I obviously I'm a complete idiot.
I believed you had the talent.
I believed I had the talent, and I was not completely uninformed. I had, I got a hold of that Coney cycling book, and I had read everything I could. And very early in my career, we went down and we did some races in Mexico. We did the Tour Baja in 74. Peter put together a California team. There was a U.S. national team going down, but he managed to talk the locals down in Mexico. This was a 14-day race to celebrate the opening of the Trans-Peninsular Road that went between the U.S. and La Paz at the end of the Baja Peninsula. It was 1,000 miles long. It was brand new, and it previously had been nothing but Jeep track. And it was 100 miles a day for 14 days. And it was the desert, and it was the spring, and it was so hot. Sometimes they'd start races at 8 in the morning, and there were places where there was no town, so they set up Mexican army camps, and we slept on cots and ate Mexican army food a number of days. And the best thing was they brought over some world champions, Polish riders, and other Eastern European riders. And it was early in the season for them. It was early in the season for us. And I got to ride against guys who were world champions on the road, at the age of 18, without having been to Europe, and realized that they're made of flesh and blood. They're the same as me and anybody else. And I had as much talent as they did. I just needed the opportunity, and decided that, as I said back then, I said, if I can race with them, I can race with them. If you stay in the United States and you only race in the United States back then, you're only going to be able to race with guys in the United States. But if you have the gumption and you get out there and race with those guys, you find out that they're not super. I mean, the stories we used to hear were unbelievable. Oh, you've got to be exactly 1 inch off the wheel of the guy in front of you. Well, you start racing with those guys and you realize, that's bullshit. It's pretty much the same as everywhere else. And so a lot of that mythology, while I was still young and full of myself and everything, a lot of that mythology was put to rest very quickly in my cycling career. And without racing in Europe, I went to the Olympics and did well against the Europeans. And so, I got some experiences, I think, back then that it just sort of came along, luckily, for the first time in my career.
Do you remember who you were idolizing back then? I mean, who were the guys that you were watching?
I mean, it was Merckx and Copy, and Copy, whose career was over. But all the whole Merckx era. I mean, so the guys we were reading about were guys, Van Impe and Merckx and Mertens and that whole sort of right before and then including area. So I mean, these guys, they were super gods, and Poulidor, all of those kind of guys. I mean, there'd be a copy of, Miroir de Ciclismo would come to the Bay Area, but eventually it would make it around to your club.
Yeah,
and you get to
talk
read
about what
stuff.
it was like trying to follow cycling in the early 70s, especially for an American trying to follow European cycling. You guys were literally waiting for foreign language magazines to come over because there was no English language coverage.
And then you get some of the English cycling magazines would come along, and they'd have the stories about all the incredible time trials they were doing over there. I mean, right. And everything. And then way in the back there'd be an article about Barry Hoban or Tommy Simpson or some guy who'd gone over and cracked the whatever they call it over there and the code and was actually making it on the continent. And so it was very similar to the U.S. Except it seemed like they had this very high level of local racing compared to the U.S. Although in retrospect, it was actually fairly similar. It's just that they had better access to Europe, and so if a guy did have talent, and it was happening here too. Again, a lot of riders went over to Europe. Most of them would go to Belgium or go to France, get their asses kicked for 60 days, and say, "Okay, I'm not a bike racer," and come home without the base and without the knowledge that. With going, you go over there with an attitude that you're inferior, you're not going to perform well, and that happened to dozens and dozens and dozens of people, and still to this day is going on. They go over there and they get their asses kicked for a while and realize it's not for them. Well, the reality is you're going to have to go over there and you're going to have to get your ass kicked for a while before your form comes on and your style and your ability to race with people begins to happen. And even today, it's actually kind of almost sort of gone back to that level. We still have a couple guys over there, but not that many. Certainly the big group of American riders that was over there for a while has not really happened. And I think that's kind of sad. And I sort of place the blame of that at the feet of the American manufacturers who are spending gobs of money to sponsor European teams, but I don't see them putting any pressure on American racing or the clubs in Europe to pick up American riders and give them a chance over there.
Yeah, it's tough for Americans. What was your first year to go to Europe? Would it have been 76, 77?
So 77, I went to Europe. So 76, we did the the Olympics and all that stuff. And before the Olympics, there was a 5 or 6 or 7 day stage race that had all the teams except the Swedish team in it. in the Montreal area, and I did very well in that. I think I was, third or fourth overall or something like that. And we even did the Mont Royal course backwards. So going into the Montreal Olympics, I'd raced against all of the teams except the Swedes, who won. So I knew all the riders at that point, and we'd raced against a lot of those guys again the second time in Baja. So they didn't know us, but we sort of knew who they were. So 77. I decided I wanted to go to Europe. I was done. Bike racing in the United States. I'd long lost interest in bike racing in the United States. To me, bike racing in the United States was against myself, and that was pretty much it. And to this day, I still, it was fun. It was great. There were lots of girls. It was this and that. But I had a focus I wanted to pursue. So I don't know how I was going to do it, but I was working the bike shop and living upstairs and saving every penny I had. And in 77, Mike Neal, as you know, had actually cracked the code. And in 76, right after the Olympics, he got 10th in the World Championships in Ostuni. Just an astonishing giant sprint finish. And I don't know, have you talked to him on your?
He's on the list. He's a couple episodes after this.
Well, ask him about the finish and ask him who pulled on his jersey and why he didn't get better than 10th. The guy was really one of probably the most talented bicycle racer America's ever produced, and one of the most talented coaches and managers the U.S. has ever produced, and just phenomenal talent on the bike and off. But he a typical Italian thing. He's having dinner with some Italians in the end of 76 and the beginning of 77, and everybody's bragging and boasting, and I'm sure the wine bottles were emptying out, and this guy, Marcello Miali, is talking about how great his little team is in Castelfranco di Sopra, which is this little teeny town of 500 people, and Mike's boasting about his buddy in America who can kick all their asses and all this stuff, and he says, well, bring him on over here, I'll put him on the team. Well, it turns out Marcello had one brother who had carried the pink jersey in the Giro back in the 60s or 50s, and he had another brother who was the race director for the Giro d'Italia. So Marcello was connected.
Yeah.
But he lived in a small town, and he had a couple of racers, and so Mike calls me up out of the blue in February and says, "Pack your shit up and come on over here." So I took what little money I had, bought a round trip ticket to Italy, and had $1,000 in my pocket, and topped on a plane to Italy, and it took me about 2 months before I won a race, but because you've got to adapt, and you got to adapt to the food, you got to adapt to the air, you got to adapt to the bugs. You get sick. I got bronchitis. I was coughing up blood about a month and a half into it. Got dysentery from drinking water out of the bad well, and that kind of stuff, and that was an introduction to life racing in Italy. And when I finally did a race, all sins were forgiven, and I was everybody's happy friend.
Everyone likes you when you're good, right? When you're riding at the front. But
there's more. You got to understand, there's more to it than that. Okay, Americans go over, you win a race, and they get cocky. Just a little story, if you don't mind. When I won the race, I was excited because Marcello had put me down publicly in front of everybody in the piazza in town the week before, so I hadn't won any races. And so I win this race, and it's a small town, and the people are really proud, and they pull up about a mile outside of town, and they stop, and they strap the flowers and everything to the top of the car, the bikes, and then them and all the follow car, everybody who went to watch the race locally comes into town with all their horns blaring, right? And they drive around the piazza in the town, and it's complete chaos, and everybody's excited. And you get out, and he kisses his wife, and you start to get out, and you're tired. It's a long, hard road race. He goes, no, get back in the car. And so I get back in the car, and we drive over to the church. Now, I'm not a religious person, and I'm certainly not a Catholic. And he says, now take the flowers, and realize I hardly speak any Italian, and he doesn't speak any English. He says, take the flowers, take them in, give them to the priest, bow down, do the whole thing, and then we'll go into town. So I do the whole thing, and the priest is happy, and we get back in the car, and we go back into town. And because I did that, because I was willing to adapt and live their life and appreciate them and everything. And I think this is more important in Italy than anything. It's like I was one of the boys. I was now part of the family of this little town in Italy. And Americans have this tendency to resist his stuff. And I did too, except that when I went over there, I said, I'm going to, when in Rome, do as the Romans. And so I really paid attention, and I really liked the people. And bike racing isn't just the bike race, but it's a whole cultural thing. I mean, these towns invest a huge amount of money in soccer teams and bike race teams and their kids, and it's really important to them. So, this is a lesson some Americans never really learn, and some other foreigners too.
Yeah, what a turning point.
Sorry about that digression, but
no, that's awesome. I mean, what a story.
Yeah, it's kind of a critical component of the whole scene over there. If you go over there and try to be an American and fit into a small town, you're just going to fail.
So you're just now adapting. You're kind of getting comfortable to the European life. You're starting to win races. But now let's talk about coming back to the U.S. for the 78, what was called the Red Zinger at that time. Before it was the Coors Classic. You were the winner there. What was it like coming back to the U.S. after, riding in Europe?
Well, I didn't want to come back. But we went to the Worlds, and in the middle of the World's road race, I got extremely sick. Someone poisoned my water bottle.
Wow.
I'm pretty sure, and I'm pretty sure it was an American rider, and I'm reasonably sure I know who it was. And I got one lap into the race, and I watched a Japanese guy pass underneath me, and I was pulled off my bike by an ambulance, and I was sick, and I lost about 5 kilos in the next 10 days. I was really sick. Something was put in. And this was down in Venezuela, and I went back to Italy, and the Italians looked at me and they said, go back to America, and we hope you can recover. It was a terrible experience. I was really fit. I was expecting to do well at the Worlds. Had been winning races. We'd win the Tour of Britain. I'd done well there. So going back to the U.S. I was pretty hammered, and it took me the whole fall and spring to build my weight back up and get back in shape. And I'm still a little irritated about that, to say it.
Yeah, I know you probably don't
politely.
want to go into too many details, but what do you think was the motivation behind the Sabotage? Was it a spot on a national team?
Well, I don't know. I think it was just some people are that way, and in America, one reason I didn't want to race in America was the experience in the Olympics, where most of the riders that were the what I would call the traditional American riders who never leave the country, all they care about is being the best American. They want to be and they will do anything to screw over the other Americans. And I'm sure that it was somewhat motivated by that. Now it could have been somebody else. I don't know, but that typically doesn't happen. So yeah, it was a hard fall season, and so I came back and worked part time and got back in shape and went and did the race in Colorado. What happened was we went back off to Europe with the U.S. national team in 78. I don't know if you know much story about this. Most people don't know about this, and we're going to have to write something about this. But in 78, the U.S. national team, under the auspices of the new Polish charlatan who had arrived to work for the U.S. Cycling Federation, decided that they would send a team to Europe and to Italy specifically. And Mike Neal was going to be the coach, and I was there. And we had Mark Pringle and a couple other riders, and we went off to Italy in 78 for about 3 months, and they gave us a round trip. And we had a journalist, Barney Rostang, and a mechanic with us. So they gave us round-trip tickets and $100 in expense money and sent us off there for 3 months, culminating with a ride in the milk race Tour of England. So we had to earn our way around Italy for 3 months.
Yeah.
And pay for hotels.
It was win or go home.
It was win or go home, and we moved into Villa de Alme Bar Augusto up near Bergamo, right outside of San Pellegrino, and rode a lot of races, Giro Baby, a lot of these races, and won a lot of bottles of wine and prosciuttos and trophies, and traded a tremendous amount of this stuff for the hotel room. Campagnolo was his co-sponsor, and somehow we scrounged up a couple of cars to use, and through Mike's connections and my connections down in Italy, Mike was able to finagle start money for a lot of these races. And And so we did all right, and we won a bunch of races. And it was actually the first time a U.S. national team had gone to Europe and won a shitload of races, and big races, and, top 5 placings and stuff, And one of the things over there is that as an amateur over there, you can't, in Italy, it's not like in Belgium. You can go to Belgium, you can ride into Kermesse. In Italy, as an international rider from another country, you can only ride the top races that are designated as international races. So all the small local learning races, unless you have an Italian license, you can't race in them. So most of the races we had Russian, Polish, Czechoslovakian, French, Italian national team, all the best, Olympic level amateur races, plus the top of the line. And believe me, these guys are no slouches, amateur Italian teams. And the amateur Italian teams included a lot of guys who couldn't quite make it as pros, or they decided not to turn pro because they were getting paid more as an amateur.
Right.
And because they could win races. So you had guys that were 30 years old racing amateurs there, which anybody who was a respectable rider was either a pro or retired by then. But these guys were good. I mean, they were almost pro level riders. So, and it's part of why the Eastern Europeans would go down and race in Italy that time of year. And the races were long and they were hard and they were sometimes 7 days long. And so that right there, we then show up back in the U.S., go to Colorado for the Red Zinger race, and we planned it really well. We managed to get rented a house in Boulder for a month, and then we spent 2 weeks at 10,000 feet training at altitude. So we spent a week in Boulder, and then 2 weeks up at 10,000 feet, and then back to Boulder for a week, and hit the race with the altitude training and a lot of European miles in our legs.
78.
So
the 78.
That's what led up to 78. Yeah.
The race was still kind of in its infancy at that time. Obviously, it wasn't. It hadn't taken the step to the Coors Classic yet. But did you see this sort of golden? I mean, did you feel like you were in a golden age of cycling at the time? I mean, in the, let's say, late 70s, early 80s, could you feel like, all right, this is going to be an important time in cycling? As you were going to Europe and then coming back, you sort of had this dual perspective, getting to see the European world and then seeing it in the U.S.
Well, that race and a few other races, but primarily that race was clearly that it was the beginning of the fact that Americans wanted to race with the Europeans, and you could start getting some of the Europeans over here, and people were starting to put on races that were big enough and with a decent prize list, and at a good part of the season when people in Europe, wanted to. I mean, there's sort of a lull in Europe in the middle of the season, and the race came along right at that time. In 1980, when I brought a team over in 80 or 81, I think it was 81, and it was a couple weeks after the Giro, so it was considered a rest race. So good money and good weather and so on and so forth. So and the Europeans were becoming less afraid of going to America. I mean, it was if we had something to offer the Europeans to come over here and race, and that was definitely the dawning of that era. That it's kind of just boiled down now to Tour California. I'm not sure. I guess there's a couple other races that come and go now and then, but I don't really follow it all that much.
Yeah. Certainly nothing has been as prolific as Tour California in the last 10 years in modern times. So things are going well. You're winning races, and then let's talk about the 1980 Olympics, because you were. I mean, that was your year. You a gold medal at the 1979 Pan Am Games. Everyone thought you were certainly a favorite going into the 1980 Games. Take me through that time in your life, because I'm sure it was an interesting one.
Well, we went to back up a little bit. We did the same thing we did in Italy. We did in France the next year. We took a team over there, raced the races in France, and that was fun. And that was because Mr. Eddie B decided that he said, "Oh, it's easy to win races in Italy. Go to France," and then we won more races in France. And I actually won the opening stage of the Circuit de la Sarthe, which was a pro race. It only had the Russians and the Americans in it.
Isn't there an Eddie Merckx quote about the difference between racing in Italy and racing in France?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, what he said to me was, if you want to win races, go to France. If you want to learn to race bikes, go to Italy, which is why I went to Italy.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So 79 was a pretty good year, and but I really wanted back to Europe anyway. And when the 80 Olympics route was announced, I mean, it was, but there was a lot of changes going on in USA cycling, and the advent of the three musketeers, you might call them, Ed Burke, Ed B, and Mike Frazee, and you got to remember, I don't have a lot of respect for Ed Borisevich. I met him when he first came to the U.S. I met him at Mike Frazee's house before anybody knew about him. And I also talked to a lot of Polish riders. I mean, we racing in Europe a lot, especially in France the next year. It's the Polish and the Czechoslovakian riders hated the Soviet riders, they weren't Russians; they were Soviet Union.
Sure.
So there were times when you would chit chat with them and also form partnerships to defeat the Soviets, and we took advantage of that. The Poles had no love for them then or now, and it was a different era back then. And
very nationalistic competition. I mean,
absolutely, yeah. And so some of the Polish riders had never heard of the guy, and a couple of them had heard of him, but they didn't know much about him except that he had been like a low-level national team rider, and raced a little bit in France, a couple of races one year, and for like a Polish B team, and was like a local coach of some kind. But his knowledge base, based on my experience with it, which at that time was now considerable, was not very good. He didn't really know a lot about how to train for bike racing. He had some bizarre ideas and concepts, don't know where they came from, but that was beginning. And then they brought this guy, Ed Burke, along, who's passed away, but he had an exercise physiology degree, but knew nothing about cycling. I mean, the first time we met him was at the 80 Olympic trials, and he made a presentation to everybody there about how you didn't need to eat food in bike races, that a 3% glucose solution in your water bottle was all you needed for a 100-mile bike race. And this guy's being presented as an expert in the field, and I was the only one who got up, and I said, "Have you ever ridden 100 miles on a bike?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, then you're full of shit." And I got up and walked out. And Dave Bowl and I were the only guys that left. And so this was the sort of new era promoted by Mike Frazee and the people that were running the United States Cycling Federation at the time. And when they brought the Polish guy in, he was starting to say really weird stuff. And then the more that you proved he was wrong, the worse off you were. So I wasn't sitting I was, Miroir de Cyclisme had me on the cover with three other guys as favorites for the Olympics. Everybody else in the cycling world had me as one of the favorites for the Olympics and so on, and I was preparing for it. I had a map of the course and the planimetry of the course before USA Cycling did, and it was a weird situation. But as soon as our friend Jimmy Carter decided, after giving me how much money to do my sport, exactly 0 pennies, decided that he was going to use sports for politics and do the boycott, I just made a phone call and I said, to some friends in Italy, and I said, this is bullshit. I want to come back and race and then turn pro. So I was able to do that in 1980, which is really all I wanted to do anyway. I mean, I wanted to do that in 78. So
yeah, almost a blessing in disguise. But talk about that was such a weird scenario then, because you guys couldn't be pro and still race the Olympics, right? You had to be an amateur prior.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And the other thing is, once you turned pro, you could never go back to being an amateur.
Right.
It's like you couldn't get your license unless some period of time had passed or something like that. I'm not even sure even that. And there were guys who had turned pro on the track and stuff. Tim Mountford and people like that. Jack Symes, they had raced pro on the track and kermesses and stuff like that up in Northern Europe and so on. So and they were around, and so they, we were aware of the penalty of getting a pro license. If you got a pro license, there was no turning back. There was no racing in the United States, and there was no turning back. In 1979, there was no expectation that the Coors Classic would come along and allow pros in it. right?
Yeah.
Just within a year. There was no expectation that there was any races really of any kind. No Philadelphia Classics, nothing. There was zero expectations that any of that was going to happen. So it was an all or nothing commitment. So I made that commitment, went over to Italy. I had to race some amateur races for a while before I turned pro, and I turned pro for a team that had Freddie Mertens on the team and a lot of top Italians. It was one of the top Italian teams, and that morphed into another team the next year. And I did 3 seasons of that, and said, that's enough. I'm done. I was tired.
Yeah.
I was done.
You were, I mean, obviously you had this pro card to play in the late 70s, but you were holding off on playing that card with the intention of racing the Olympics. I mean, certainly there were offers for you in the late 70s, yeah.
Sure. And if I'd pursued it, I probably could have turned pro in 79 or 78 or something. But I didn't really pursue it because at that point the Olympics was looking really good. I mean, it was like, okay, we're finally getting our stuff together. We're, getting a medal in the 80 Olympics, had it been a real full Olympics, would have been, a good moneymaker in the United States. It would have been a really good card to play here had I decided to come back here and race. The racing was getting better here. It was starting to get somewhat interesting. It was certainly a hell of a lot easier than racing in Europe. But still, my goal in life, I mean, I wanted to race with Merckx. I wanted to race with Mertens. I wanted to race with Van Imp. I wanted to race with those guys. And I got to race with a lot of them. I mean, in retrospect, I'm thankful I didn't get to race with Merckx. Because all the guys on my team said that it wasn't fun racing with him.
What was it like going to the European team? I mean, what was the transition from? I can't imagine they let you race for the win when you have a guy like Mertens on the team a whole lot. Did you get any opportunities to race?
No, I never got an opportunity. I mean, it was an unwritten rule, and it was very clearly explained that if you didn't do exactly what you're told in the races, that you would finish the race, and sometimes, I mean, you'd heard stories, let's put it that way, of a guy finishes the race, gets to his hotel room, and he's got no room, and his bag is there waiting in the lobby for him, and he's dirty and filthy, and he's got his bike in his bag, or if they're nice, the next time there's a race, like, oh, I've decided, you need to rest, and eventually they sort of play you out that way. And I kind of think that's what happened to Mike. Mike got his contract because of an Australian, Gary Cleveley, who the Italians are very nice to the people they bring in, and I think they wanted somebody who spoke English and that, and so they brought Mike along, and Mike had some talent, but Gary Cleveley got weird partway through the season the next year, left, and Mike found himself being told that he didn't have the heart for racing, and that he should, and the next thing he knew, he was, they give him a job working in the mattress factory at 9 Flex, and they send you these messages really clearly, if you're remotely perceptive. So,
yeah, I'd say.
Yeah, it was hard, but the thing is, I didn't go over there. I didn't have the talent of a Le Mans. It was. I had a goal that I wanted to accomplish, which was to get over there and race with those guys and have that experience, and I did, and I'm very happy about it.
Yeah, it sounds like you were able to walk away, with a satisfied heart, a full heart from your career, and you kind of got to leave on your own terms, and it was a mutual agreement, I guess. You were ready to come home.
Pretty much. Well, I actually had an offer for the next season to go on a smaller team, and it was explained that I would have more opportunity to do in the races what I wanted to do. And but I was tired. I mean, we were racing, over 100 days of racing a year, and the average race was over 160 miles if you average it out. And I was just tired of it. And I think actually the story that thing was it was early in the season, about this time of year, the last year I was racing, and I rode Milan San Remo, and I did my work, and I went to the hotel at the end of the race. And they make you pull over. You don't even bother finishing because the hotels, they put the hotel before the finish. So everybody pulls over, tempting. You go to the hotel, right. And don't bother with the last climb.
Right.
Just get in the hotel and get cleaned up so we can head home earlier. and you've done your work on every climb. On the last climb, you let the brake is gone or whatever. And I take a shower and I'm combing my hair, and I had 2 gray hairs in my head that I didn't have that morning. And I was 28 years old. And I said, and it was, you're at the end of a 280 kilometer race and you're tired and you're slack and it's early in the season. And I just said, if I'm not having fun at the end of the season, I'm just going to go back to California. I don't want to be like a 33-year-old guy working in a bike shop who's, never really quite finished what he wanted to do. I'm happy with what I've done. And at the end of the season, I wasn't having fun. And every year I started to get more knee pains right around the end of the season, October, it was like my body was starting to show some wear. And I said, it's just with the right training and this and that and the right team, I could race another 3 or 4 years, but I'm not going to be winning any big tours or anything. So I quit. That was it. Went home after the Worlds in Goodwood.
You got to do some of the, the most important races in your career. You got to go to, obviously, the Pan Am Games, the Olympics, the Giro, Milan-San Remo. Does one event stick out in your mind that, that you kind of think back like, man, that was cool. I got to do whatever it was. What was your biggest accomplishment, your biggest achievement for if you had to pick one race?
Well, I think the Olympics was a good race, and I think had the potential to do better if the race had unfolded slightly differently. I spent too much time up front early in the race, but I had to. I had no choice. But it was that was a good event, and I felt satisfied and that I accomplished something, and I'd done it my way. And other than that, it's just everything was just kind of building on other races and so on and so forth, and coming back from injuries and so on. It's hard to single out really any big event over there.
I love that, like a true bike racer, you can still remember doing too much work at the front of a race that was 30 some years ago, but that it sticks in your mind. I mean, I have to remember you have you remember almost every mile of a race like that.
A race like that. I mean, there are races. I mean, I literally, especially like local stuff in California when I was winning. I mean, I was winning a lot of races, and people come up and go, "Do you remember this race you won?" It's like I don't even remember the race.
Right.
But part of it is, it's you've only got the capacity to remember so much, and winning every criterium in Central California or road race early in the season in California isn't they're all stepping stones. They're just ways to gauge your fitness level locally and let you know how you, for me anyway, it was always, I mean, like I said, I never considered, when I started racing, the big stars were John Ellis and John Howard and people like that. And I never, even from day one, considered them to be personal competitors. They were just milestones and so on and so forth. And probably the thing that I'm the most proud of is that I, along with a bunch of other racers, but with sort of me spear pointing it, it started a new era of cycling in the United States. I mean, there was the old era, and then there was a new era, and the new era came along and launched more racing and more excitement about the sport. And when we got into races, they weren't these long, drawn-out slugfests. There was racing going on. There was team tactics. There was, I mean, we were taught to, keep your socks clean and keep your jersey zipped up at the finish line, and it wasn't these, the racing was exciting, and you could go, I think it really, the whole level of racing in the U.S. upped, and some of the older guys, stepped up and were able to handle it, but a lot of them just went, you know what, I'm going to go back and work in the bike shop. So. And it wasn't just me. I mean, there was right before me, there was an era they called the senior killers, and you had Tom Ritchie and Chris Haley and a bunch of other guys came along in 1974 and 1973 and were juniors, and they were beating everybody in the U.S. And the Cycling Federation had to make rules to keep them from winning all the races. And then I came along, and guys like Mark Pringle and other people. And, and like I said, some of the racers stepped up, and a lot of them retired, and racing got more exciting. And I think that it still shows today.
It was a very cool time for bike racing in America. That's for sure. Brought some important results, some important changes, and some good stories. George, I hate to say this, but we got to wrap this up. I am running out of time on my end. So on behalf of everyone at Laser Radio, thanks for taking the time, man. Some really interesting stuff today.
Sure. Thanks. I'm, I don't know if you're familiar with the Red Kite Prayer guys, but I'm going to write some of these stories up for them and publish them this fall probably.
Cool. Yeah.
So we're sort of some of us are kind of mission to sort of capture this stuff before we get too old to remember it all. So hopefully we'll get some stories out there.
That's a little bit what we're trying to do here on Laser Radio as well. So we appreciate you taking the time,
Yeah,
George.
I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for letting this old guy tell some stories. Most of it's true.
Thanks for taking the time. It was more than a pleasure. That's George Mount. George, thanks again. That's it for today's episode of Laser Radio. Be sure to check out more great shows on our hosts on the Wide Angle Podium Network. Until next time, I'm Brad Sohner, saying thanks for listening.